Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
Glad to be here.
So, I want you to imagine something. Think about a billionaire CEO, right at the absolute peak of their power.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And they wake up tomorrow to find their entire global empire has been reduced to just, well, a barren rock. Like a place where fishermen literally dry their nets.
That is quite the visual.
Right. Or picture the world's most terrifying military superpower just suddenly swallowed up by the earth, ending up as like a silent exhibit in a subterranean museum of dead empires.
Yeah, just completely erased from relevance.
Exactly. And today we are opening up an ancient text that promises exactly that. We are taking a deep dive into the book of Ezekiel, chapters 25 through 32.
It's a really heavy section.
It is. It's basically a guided tour through a graveyard of human hubris. So where do we even start with this?
Well, to really grasp the weight of what we're looking at, we have to ground ourselves in the 580s BC.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Right, so the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East is going through this massive violent restructuring. The Babylonian Empire is basically sweeping across the known world.
Led by King Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Exactly. Look at an unstoppable force of nature. And the epicenter of this trauma, at least for our author, Ezekiel, is the fall of Jerusalem.
Which was just a brutal event.
Oh, absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
The city has been subjected to this prolonged siege. People have starved, the walls are breached, and the sacred temple is just reduced to ash.
And Ezekiel isn't even there when it falls, is he?
No, he's actually a captive. He's sitting by a river in Babylon, hundreds of miles away.
Wow.
Yeah, he's watching the catastrophic collapse of his homeland from afar.
Yeah.
Getting these delayed reports of the devastation.
And what absolutely fascinates me about this text, and this is why we're doing this deep dive, is where Ezekiel points his camera in this exact moment.
Yeah, it's a huge pivot.
Because you would expect an entire section dedicated just to the weeping of Jerusalem or, condemning the cruelty of Babylon.
Which would make complete sense.
Right. But right at the apex of this national tragedy, Ezekiel turns his gaze outward.
He does.
He starts delivering these incredibly precise, searing messages directed at 7 neighboring pagan nations.
Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt.
Yeah, those 7. He is hyper-focused on how these bystanders are reacting to the smoke rising from Jerusalem.
And that pivot is the crucial foundation for the core wisdom we really want to extract today.
How so?
Because Ezekiel is diagnosing a sickness of the human heart that entirely transcends the ancient world. He begins with the immediate neighbors, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia.
Nations that shared borders with Israel.
Right, borders and very complex, often violent histories. So when the Babylonian war machine crushed Jerusalem, the Ammonites didn't just watch passively.
They reacted.
The text specifically records it. When the sanctuary was profaned and the land made desolate, the Ammonites cheered.
Like out loud.
Literally, they clapped their hands and stamped their feet, shouting, "Aha!"
Wow, just pure, unadulterated gloating.
And Moab chimed in with this theological mockery. They declared that the house of Judah was just like all the other heathen nations.
Basically saying, see, your God is powerless to save you.
Exactly. It was proof to them that Israel's entire worldview was a joke.
So it's the ultimate ancient example of schadenfreude. That uniquely German word for taking pleasure in someone else's pain.
Yes, the joy in another's sorrow.
But, okay, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go for it.
Because I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a modern reader looking at this. Isn't this reaction just a deeply ingrained, almost natural human instinct?
It's definitely common, yeah.
Right. Like, let's take it out of the bloody context of ancient warfare and look at modern corporate rivalries.
Okay, I see where you're going.
If a massive tech company completely bungles a product launch and their stock just craters overnight, the executives at their biggest rival are absolutely popping champagne in the boardroom.
Oh, without a doubt.
They're clapping their hands or, look at the anatomy of a social media pylon.
That's a great example.
Millions of people basically gather in the digital town square to stamp their feet and shout, aha, when a public figure experiences a downfall.
We see it every single day.
We do. We take no sides here, but just observing human nature, it happens constantly. So if this is just standard human behavior, why does Ezekiel dedicate an entire chapter to condemning it as a profound moral failing?
Well, you're touching on the surface level symptom, which is opportunism, but the root cause Ezekiel points to is something much darker.
What's the root?
The prophet isn't just criticizing these nations for gaining a sudden geopolitical advantage. He is indicting them for a profound rot within their character.
A rot.
Yeah. The specific phrase used in the ancient Hebrew to describe their rejoicing implies a contempt of soul.
Contempt of soul, that's heavy.
It is. They didn't just benefit from the fall. They took deep, malicious delight in the suffering and humiliation of these people.
It wasn't just business, it was personal.
Very personal. Edom, for instance, didn't just gloat. They used the chaos to take cruel vengeance. They were likely hunting down refugees or making these opportunistic border incursions while Israel was defenseless.
Just kicking them when they were down.
Exactly. And the Philistines, the text says they acted out of a perpetual hatred.
Generational malice.
Right. So the theological principle operating in the background here is that the divine is fiercely protective of human dignity.
Even in judgment.
Especially then. Even when a nation is undergoing severe judgment, their humanity remains intact. And nothing provokes divine anger quite like malice dressed up as triumph.
So the line is drawn at malice. It's the difference between picking up a discarded wallet on the sidewalk and actively cheering while you watch someone get mugged.
That is a harsh but very accurate way to put it.
And God responds to this malice.
Decisively. The judgment pronounced on these nations is a stark mirror of their own actions.
Like a boomerang effect.
Exactly. The Ammonites, who thought the Babylonian destruction made them safe, are promised that they will be handed over to the nomadic tribes of the east.
Oh, wow.
Their glorious capital city will literally become a stable for camels. They forgot that a fire burning down your neighbor's house doesn't respect property lines.
It will eventually catch your roof, too.
Always does.
This translates so sharply into our modern lives. I mean, how we respond to the failure of others is basically an X-ray of our own character.
It reveals everything about us.
It's incredibly easy to disguise our envy or our petty grievances as a pursuit of justice. Like, oh, they're just being held accountable.
Right. We love to use the word accountability to mask our schadenfreude.
But the text is warning us that when we revel in someone else's downfall, we are actively poisoning our own humanity.
And this demands a practical reflection for anyone listening right now.
Yeah, let's bring this home for the listener.
Think about the landscape of your own life, your own career. When your neighbor's house is on fire, whether there's a rival coworker who gets passed over for a promotion or a competing business that suddenly faces bankruptcy.
Or even just a personal acquaintance you've always secretly disliked who hits a devastating rough patch.
Exactly. What is your internal reflex? Do you feel a rush of adrenaline and smug satisfaction? Do you stand back and warm your hands by the flames of their crisis?
That's a convicting question.
Because according to this ancient wisdom, the warmth you feel is actually the burning away of your own soul.
Wow, that's a profound way to look at it.
It sets the stage for the next section, too.
Right, because if Ammon and Moab represent the petty theft of local opportunism, the next nation on Ezekiel's list represents something entirely different.
A massive escalation.
Yeah. We are moving from the neighbors clapping their hands to a highly sophisticated global system capitalizing on human suffering.
We are talking about the island city of Tyre, chapters 26 and 27.
Tyre. Okay, tell us about Tyre, because they weren't just a regular city.
Not at all. Tyre was a marvel of the ancient world. It wasn't just a city. It was the undisputed financial and maritime capital of the Mediterranean.
Like the ancient equivalent of Wall Street mixed with London.
Exactly. It sat on an island just off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, heavily fortified and incredibly wealthy.
So how do they react when they see the smoke rising from Jerusalem?
They don't bother with petty mocking like Ammon. Their reaction is pure, cold, calculated economics.
Just numbers on a ledger.
Right. They look at the ruins of Jerusalem and they say, I shall be replenished, now she is laid waste.
It's chilling. They literally look at a slaughtered population and see a market opportunity.
That's exactly what it was.
Because Jerusalem was a major inland toll booth on the ancient trade routes, right?
Yes, a massive commercial hub.
So Tyre realizes that with Jerusalem smashed, all that commercial traffic, all that capital is going to bypass the inland route and flow straight into their coastal harbors.
They are commodifying a national tragedy.
Which brings down one of the most uniquely devastating prophecies in the entire book.
It really does. Ezekiel predicts in chapter 26 that Nebuchadnezzar will arrive with a massive army, horses, chariots, siege engines.
And historically, we know the siege of Tyre was an absolute nightmare.
A total grind. It lasted 13 grueling years, building causeways out into the ocean, hurling stones, just a brutal war of attrition.
But the punishment God decrees isn't just a regime change, is it?
No, it's total erasure. The text says Tyre will be scraped clean. The rubble of its magnificent walls and luxurious houses will be thrown into the sea.
Which actually happened historically.
Yes, and the island will become nothing more than a flat, bare rock where fishermen spread their nets to dry.
From the financial center of the world to a drying rack for nets.
It's a staggering collapse.
To really understand the weight of that threat, we have to understand what Tyre was before it fell. And chapter 27 does this brilliantly.
Ezekiel shifts his writing style completely here.
He does. He moves away from geopolitical declarations and he writes an elegy, a funeral dirge.
And he structures it around this breathtaking metaphor. He describes the entire city-state of Tyre as a colossal, magnificent, unsinkable merchant ship.
And the detail here is extraordinary. Let's unpack the ship, because the prophet constructs it piece by piece to show the sheer reach of Tyre's wealth.
Right, so the ship's hull is crafted from the finest cypress trees of Senir.
Only the best materials.
Exactly. The mast is a towering cedar from Lebanon. The oars are carved from the mighty oaks of Bashan. The deck is inlaid with ivory brought across the sea from the islands of Edom.
And the sails aren't just standard canvas. They are made of fine embroidered linen from Egypt.
Which function as a massive banner, so every port knew exactly who was arriving.
And a total flex of wealth. But the awnings covering the deck are what really get me. They are dyed in Tyrian purple and blue.
Yes, let's pause on that purple dye.
I really want to, because this explains so much about their wealth. In the ancient world, purple wasn't just a pretty color, it was the ultimate status symbol.
Because it was so incredibly hard to make.
Right. Tyre had basically cornered the market on extracting this dye from the murex sea snail.
And it took thousands of these tiny rotting snails to produce a single ounce of dye.
It was this incredibly labor-intensive, foul-smelling process, but it yielded a color that didn't fade in the sun. In fact, it actually grew brighter with washing.
So rare and so expensive that only royalty could afford it.
Exactly. So the fact that their ship's awnings are made of this stuff, it's the ancient equivalent of a billionaire driving a solid gold yacht. It is a portrait of unadulterated luxury.
It is. And then Ezekiel lists the manifest of the ship's cargo, which reveals a highly integrated global economy.
This shatters that modern illusion we have, right? That the ancient world was just a collection of disconnected, primitive villages.
Completely shatters it. Tyre was running a global supply chain. Tarshish is bringing massive quantities of silver, iron, tin, and lead.
Heavy metals.
Yep. Dedan is supplying ivory and ebony. Sheba is bringing the finest spices and gold.
But interspersed in this massive list of luxury goods is a really dark reality.
Very dark. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech are listed as trading bronze vessels and the persons of men.
Human slaves, traded right alongside cookware.
That detail completely stops you in your tracks.
It does. They are moving human beings on the exact same ledger as bronze pots and cedar logs.
It reveals the moral rot at the very foundation of their economic miracle. But we have to exercise some careful wisdom with discernment here.
Okay, let's discern.
The text of Ezekiel, and by extension, the divine perspective, does not condemn trade, commerce, or wealth inherently.
Right. It's not anti-capitalist by default.
Exactly. In fact, the poetry actually lingers on the beauty of the craftsmanship, the vastness of the trade routes. The earth's resources are meant to be cultivated and shared.
So what's the actual sin?
The sin of Tyre is not that they were merchants. The sin is their zero-sum greed. They viewed the tragedy of their neighbors purely as a profit margin.
Let me see if I can translate this mechanism into a modern framework.
Let's do it.
When we talk about an unsinkable ship driven by wealth, the immediate lazy comparison is always the RMS Titanic.
Sure, the hubris of the unsinkable ship.
But the Titanic sank because of a physical accident, an iceberg. What Ezekiel is describing with Tyre is much closer to the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, that's a much better parallel.
Or the sudden collapse of a modern, too-big-to-fail institution like Lehman Brothers. Tyre was so deeply leveraged in the economic stability of the surrounding nations that they became completely blind to systemic risk.
That is a sharp analogy.
Yeah.
Because the text says, "Thy rowers have brought thee into great waters. The east wind hath broken thee in the midst of the seas."
The rowers.
Yes. The leadership, the policymakers, the market drivers, they steered the entire enterprise into deep, volatile waters out of pure ambition.
They assumed their wealth insulated them from consequence.
But when the east wind of the Babylonian conquest hit, the entire interconnected web pulled them underwater.
And the reaction of the global market in the text is exactly like a Wall Street panic.
It's pure chaos.
Ezekiel says that when Tyre goes down, the pilots cry out so loudly that the suburbs shake.
The other merchants, the princes of the sea, physically step down from their thrones.
They strip off their embroidered garments and they just sit in the dust trembling.
And they aren't weeping out of compassion for Tyre.
Not at all. They are terrified for their own portfolio.
Exactly. They look at this sudden catastrophic collapse and realize, if the anchor of the global economy can be shattered in an instant, none of us are safe.
It's a terrifying realization of vulnerability, which naturally leads to the next profound psychological question, I think.
Which is?
How does a system become that blind in the first place?
Yeah.
How do the rowers convince themselves that they can navigate those deep waters without any consequence?
To answer that, Ezekiel zooms in. He moves from the macroeconomics of the city down to the micropsychology of its leader.
In chapter 28,
Yes, in chapter 28, we meet the Prince of Tyre,
the individual who sits at the very top of the food chain.
the guy in charge of it all.
He looks at his impenetrable island fortress, his overflowing treasuries, his absolute market dominance, and his internal narrative just completely detaches from reality.
He utters this breathtaking blasphemy. He says, I am a god. I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas.
I mean, it is the absolute apex of human delusion.
And Ezekiel responds to this claim of divinity with biting, heavy sarcasm.
Oh, I love this part.
The prophet says, Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from thee.
And we have to keep in mind, Daniel is a contemporary historical figure here.
Right, a fellow Hebrew captive who had risen to immense political prominence in Babylon, specifically for his wisdom and his ability to interpret mysteries.
So the Prince of Tyre looks at his own success and genuinely believes he has outsmarted everyone, even the legendary wise men of his era.
He equates his ability to generate vast wealth with actual omniscience.
This highlights a massive obstacle to growth for us today, because it challenges one of our most deeply embedded cultural assumptions.
How so?
Well, we live in a society that practically worships financial and technological success as the ultimate metric of human value.
We really do.
If an entrepreneur builds a billion-dollar platform, we automatically hand them a microphone. We just assume they're a genius about everything: macroeconomics, political science, public health, the future of human consciousness.
We treat them like oracles.
Yes. But Ezekiel pushes back violently against this assumption. He says, With thy wisdom and with thine understanding thou hast gotten thee riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches.
The prophet is identifying a psychological phenomenon here. Immense success creates a reality distortion field.
A reality distortion field. Break that down.
When you are constantly told you are right, when your decisions consistently yield massive profits, and when you are surrounded by people whose livelihoods depend on agreeing with you.
The sycophants.
Right. You lose the friction required for self-awareness. Ezekiel uses a brilliant poetic phrase to diagnose the prince's condition. He says, Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness.
Corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness. I want to linger on that because the mechanism is just fascinating.
It's so counterintuitive.
It is. The very things that make you successful, your brilliance, your charisma, your drive, actually become the mechanism that destroys your ability to think clearly.
The brightness literally blinds you to your own flaws.
And to drive the point home, Ezekiel elevates the language from a geopolitical critique to universal mythical imagery.
He starts describing the king of Tyre not just as a human monarch, but using the language of perfection.
He says, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God.
Right. Every precious stone was they covering. And he lists 9 specific precious stones, including the sapphire, the emerald, and the diamond.
Which intriguingly paralleled the stones worn on the breastplate of the high priest of Israel.
They do. And then the text calls him the anointed cherub that covereth, walking among the stones of fire.
Which introduces an incredible layer of comparative insight for us.
It's a huge theological talking point.
Because for centuries, traditions have read Ezekiel 28 and seen more than just a wealthy ancient king. They've seen a poetic description of the fall of a divine being, specifically the fall of Lucifer.
Yes, the idea of an angelic being, perfect in beauty, residing in the garden of God until pride was found in his heart, causing him to be cast out to the ground.
Now, the debate over whether this is a direct reference to Satan, or an allusion to the fall of Adam and Eden, or simply the use of exalted cosmic metaphor to describe human arrogance, That debate is vast.
Endless, really.
But the core wisdom remains identical regardless of the theological interpretation.
Which is that hubris always invites nemesis.
Always. When a created being forgets their mortality, when they begin to believe they are the uncaused cause of their own perfection, their destruction is locked in.
The text promises that this anointed cherub will be cast to the ground, laid before kings as a spectacle, and reduced to ashes upon the earth.
Taking this out of the ancient mythos and placing it right into our 21st century reality, we see this archetype constantly.
It's the modern masters of the universe.
Exactly. It's the tech billionaire who decides they can casually re-engineer the human genome or disrupt global infrastructure without any ethical oversight because they believe they are fundamentally smarter than the rest of the species.
Or the absolute political ruler who surrounds themselves with yes men until they actually believe their own state propaganda.
But it doesn't even require a global stage.
No, it happens on a micro level, too.
It could be a brilliant surgeon or an aggressive defense attorney or a top-tier athlete. Someone who becomes so insulated by their own brightness, their talent and success, that they become arrogant, untouchable, and frankly, toxic to everyone around them.
Which forces a very uncomfortable practical reflection for the listener.
Let's hear it.
Where in your own life has your success made you unteachable?
Oof.
Have you achieved a level of competence, wealth, or status in your specific domain that has caused you to stop listening to feedback? Have you corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness?
That is a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is, because the text is clear. The moment you begin to operate as if you are a god in your particular sphere, you are meticulously setting the stage for your own public collapse.
That is a heavy diagnostic tool.
And we're not done.
No, we're not. If Tyre represents the corruption of immense wealth and the illusion of self-made omniscience, the next target on Ezekiel's map takes us to the corruption of absolute political power.
And the illusion of false security.
Yes. We are leaving the island fortress and heading south, down to the land of the pyramids. We are entering chapters 29 through 32, which are entirely dedicated to Egypt.
And the imagery shifts dramatically here to match the geography.
Ezekiel doesn't describe Pharaoh as a merchant ship or an exalted cherub, does he?
No, he describes the ruler of Egypt as a great dragon, or, more accurately translated in the context of the Nile, a massive ancient crocodile.
A crocodile.
Lying in the midst of his rivers, completely secure, the absolute apex predator of his environment.
And what does this giant crocodile say? He boasts, "My river is my own and I have made it for myself."
The arrogance is just astounding.
It's wild. He is looking at the Nile River, this massive geographical phenomenon that has existed for millennia, depositing rich silt, watering the crops, sustaining millions of lives, and he has the sheer delusion to claim, "I built this."
It is the ultimate delusion of the self-made man, just expanded to an imperial scale.
He's taking credit for geography.
Exactly. Pharaoh is completely ignoring providence, the God who provides all natural resources. He's taking absolute personal credit for the blessings of history.
And God's response is brutally vivid.
The prophecy declares that God will put hooks in the jaws of this great crocodile, drag him up out of the river with all the fish sticking to his scales, and throw him out into the open desert.
The very ecosystem he claimed to have created will be left behind.
And he will become food for the beasts of the field.
But, I'm looking at this text, and there is something that really confuses me here.
What's that?
The other nations we talked about, Ammon clapping their hands, Edom taking revenge, Tyre trying to steal trade routes, their crimes against Israel make logical sense as hostile actions.
Right, they were active aggressors or opportunists.
But Egypt wasn't attacking Israel. In fact, historically, Israel had allied with Egypt. They were leaning on Pharaoh for military support to protect them from the Babylonians.
They were.
So why is God singling out Egypt for judgment as a bad ally? That seems completely backward.
That is exactly the nuance we need to unpack, because it reveals a vital lesson about the nature of dependency.
Okay, unpack it for me.
Egypt's crime wasn't overt hostility. It was fostering a toxic, false dependency. Ezekiel uses a brilliant metaphor here. He calls Egypt a staff of reed to the house of Israel.
A staff of reed.
Think about a reed growing along the banks of the Nile. It looks tall, thick, and sturdy. If you are exhausted and wading through the mud, it looks like a perfect walking stick to lean on.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But the moment you put your full weight on a hollow reed, it splinters under the pressure. And the sharp shards pierce right through your hand and tear your shoulder.
Oh man, that makes perfect sense. So the anger isn't just that Egypt was weak, it's that they were deceptively weak, and they loved the geopolitical leverage of having Israel dependent on them.
Yes. By promising military protection they couldn't actually deliver, Egypt drew Israel away from trusting in God and led them into disastrous political blunders.
They gave Israel a false sense of security that ultimately resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem.
Exactly. And this introduces a highly complex theological reality in chapter 29 that requires careful discernment from us.
Lay it on us.
Ezekiel delivers a prophecy where God explicitly states that he's going to give the land of Egypt to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon as wages.
Wages, like a paycheck.
Literally. The text notes that Nebuchadnezzar's army served a great service against Tyre for 13 years. They worked so hard that every head was rubbed bald and every shoulder peeled from carrying siege works.
Just a miserable grind.
But they received no real plunder from Tyre. The wealthy Tyrians likely shipped their assets away on boats before the walls fell. So God says essentially, I am going to use Egypt as Nebuchadnezzar's paycheck.
That is an incredibly uncomfortable idea for modern readers.
It really is.
God is openly declaring that he is using a ruthless, secular, even pagan conqueror as his instrument to execute historical justice.
It shatters our desire for neat, tidy moral doxas. We want history to be a simple narrative where the good guys wear white hats and the bad guys wear black hats.
We want it to be straightforward.
But Ezekiel forces us to look at a macro view of history where the divine will operates in ways that transcend our comfort zones. Sometimes flawed, brutal human systems are allowed to dismantle other corrupt human systems to bring about a long-term correction.
Bringing this macro historical view back down to the micro level for the listener, the metaphor of the staff of reed is universally applicable.
It is. We all have a deep-seated tendency to look for absolute security in things that are fundamentally fragile.
That is the modern translation of Egypt.
Think about what the staff of reed is in your life right now.
It could be a highly volatile career path that you are relying on for your entire sense of identity and self-worth.
Or a toxic romantic relationship where a partner promises to be your ultimate savior, but constantly splinters under pressure and lets you down.
It could be a political movement or a charismatic leader who promises to fix all of society's complex problems, but is morally hollow at the core.
Exactly. When you lean your full existential weight on these things, they don't just fail to support you, they actively break and injure you.
So the practical reflection here is really twofold. First, evaluate your dependencies. Are you leaning your full weight on something or someone that is fundamentally a fragile reed?
And second, looking back at the crocodile in the river, are you falsely taking absolute credit for the rivers of blessing in your life?
Are you arrogant enough to think you built the river, or can you admit that you were just fortunate enough to swim in it?
Those reflections require immense humility.
They really do. But Ezekiel does not let up on Pharaoh's ego. As we move into chapters 31 and 32, he delivers the grand finale of this geopolitical tour.
He turns to the ruler of Egypt and essentially demands a historical reality check.
He says, you think your empire is immune to the cycles of history. Let's look at the graveyard. Let's look at who came before you.
And he brings up the Assyrian Empire.
Chapter 31 is the felling of the great cedar.
Yes. If Egypt was a crocodile, Assyria was a massive, majestic cedar tree in Lebanon.
The imagery is just gorgeous. The tree was so tall, its top reached the clouds. Its roots were fed by deep subterranean waters.
All the birds of the sky made their nests in its boughs, and all the great nations lived under its vast shade.
The text even says that the trees in the Garden of Eden envied its beauty. Assyria was the undisputed, terrifying superpower of the previous century.
But Ezekiel asks Pharaoh to look at what happened to that magnificent tree.
Because its heart was lifted up in its height.
Exactly. God delivered it into the hand of the mighty one of the nations. The tree was cut down.
The imagery depicts this colossal organism just crashing into the valleys, its massive branches broken and scattered in the ravines.
The birds and animals that used to take shelter under it now just sit on its ruined trunk. The point is to violently strip away Pharaoh's sense of exceptionalism.
Basically saying, Assyria was greater than you and Assyria was destroyed.
Which sets the stage for chapter 32, one of the most haunting cinematic passages in all of ancient literature.
It's structured as a funeral dirge, but it reads like a descent into the underworld.
Ezekiel describes Pharaoh and the multitudes of Egypt physically descending into Sheol, the ancient concept of the pit, the dark realm of the dead.
As Egypt falls, the sun and the moon are darkened. The stars are covered with thick clouds.
It's not just a military defeat. It's the collapse of their entire cosmological worldview. The universe itself is pulling the blinds closed on their empire.
The descent into Sheol is the ultimate existential equalizer. Down in the pit, Ezekiel describes this massive, silent graveyard of empires.
Pharaoh arrives in the dark, and what does he see? He sees the ghosts of his predecessors.
He sees Ashur, the mighty Assyrians. He sees Elam, Meshech, Tubal, Edom, and the princes of the north, the Sidonians.
These were nations that used to cause absolute terror in the land of the living.
They used to march their seemingly invincible armies across the earth, burning cities, taking slaves, dictating the course of human events.
And now they lie silently in the dark. Their swords are laid uselessly under their heads, their terrors completely extinguished.
I visualize this as walking through a vast subterranean museum of history's greatest conquerors. Every single ruler in that pit thought they were the main character of reality.
They thought their power was eternal.
And now they are just dust and bones, sleeping in the dark with the uncircumcised, which, in this context, represents those completely cut off from the covenant of life and meaning.
It is a chilling, profound reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, no matter how technologically advanced, no matter how much wealth it hoards, escapes the great equalizer of death and historical irrelevance.
It's a heavy meditation on mortality. It forces us to reckon with the impermanence of human ambition.
It does. But if we look incredibly closely at the text, there is a glimmer of hope.
A tiny point of light piercing this dark underground cavern.
Because among all these destroyed nations, meticulously listed in the pit, Assyria, Elam, Edom, Egypt, Tyre, there's one nation that is conspicuously absent.
Judah is not listed in the pit.
They aren't there.
I almost missed that. Which is wild, considering that Jerusalem was just destroyed, the temple is burned, and the people are currently marching in chains into exile in Babylon.
To the naked eye, they look just as dead as Assyria.
To the geopolitical observer, yeah, they are finished.
But God does not consign them to the graveyard of dead empires. In chapter 29, tucked right into the middle of the prophecies against Egypt, God makes a quiet promise.
What does he say?
He says, "In that day will I cause the horn of the house of Israel to bud forth."
A horn is an ancient symbol of strength, right? Vitality, new life.
Exactly. He is promising a future restoration for them. And here is the profound theological insight we can extract from this whole section.
Let's hear it.
Judgment and the silent pit are the final irreversible end for those who worship themselves, for those whose pride is absolute and unyielding.
Like the Prince of Tyre or Pharaoh.
Right. But for those who are willing to be disciplined, corrected, and refined by their suffering, there is life after the fall. The ruins of their current reality are not the end of their story.
The diagnostic muddy waters clear up entirely with that thought. If you build your life on the illusion that you are a god, that your vast wealth makes you untouchable, or that your political power will last forever, you are building a monument that is destined for the pit.
The universe has a 0% survival rate for absolute hubris.
But if you accept correction, if you maintain humility and recognize that you did not create the river you swim in, there is the promise of the budding horn. There is the promise of authentic restoration.
It is a call to deeply, honestly examine the foundation of the lives and the societies we are building.
And that brings us right back to you, the listener. You've just walked with us through the smoking ruins of Ammon, the scraped bare rock of the island of Tyre, and the silent subterranean graveyard of Egypt and Assyria.
The monuments to their opportunistic gloating, their zero-sum greed, and their blinding pride are gone. They're just dust.
So the question we want to leave you with today is this. What are you building right now? Is the life, the career, the legacy you are constructing a monument to your own perfect beauty, a hollow structure that will splinter when tested and eventually end up in the pit? Or are you building something grounded in humility, rooted in authentic truth, and capable of surviving the unavoidable storms of history?
I think that's the ultimate takeaway.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.